The Missouri River. Where does it come from? Where does it begin? Does it come close to another large river that empties into the Pacific Ocean? What about the landscape? What is it like? And the people and the animals who live there, what are they like? These were the questions of 1803. These were the questions to be answered by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson, they would lead the Corps of Discovery on a long journey to the Pacific Ocean. Their job, their assignment, was to unravel the mysteries of the Missouri River and beyond. In 1803, France sold the territory of Louisiana to the United States. 800,000 square miles for $15 million. At 3 cents an acre, it would prove to be one of the best real estate bargains in history. Yet in 1803, President Jefferson did not really know what he was buying. And for that matter, Napoleon Bonaparte did not really know what he was selling. In 1803, the land west of the Mississippi was, for the most part, unexplored wilderness. Back in 1801, Jefferson asked Captain Meriwether Lewis to be his private secretary. However, as private secretary, Lewis was instructed by Jefferson to prepare for a Western expedition. In 1803, Lewis selected William Clark, an Army friend, as co-commander. For 6 months, from December to the following May, the two captains assembled men and supplies at Camp Wood. Camp Wood was located in Illinois Territory, across from the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. On May 14, 1804, Clark wrote, "I set out at 4:00 p.m. and proceeded on under a gentle breeze up the Missouri." Thus began the long journey upriver on the longest river in North America. The expedition, called the Corps of Discovery, had approximately 45 members, most of whom were soldiers. In addition to the soldiers, there were 8 French-Canadian boatmen, 1 interpreter, and Clark's black servant, York. Add 1 more if you count the space taken by Lewis's big Newfoundland dog, Seaman. Going upriver, men and supplies were divided among 3 boats, a large 55-foot-long keel boat and 2 smaller pirogues. Going upriver, they used oars, pushed with poles, or pulled with ropes. If the wind was right, they used sails. Walking instead of riding, the hunters went ahead, searching for food. Although some food was carried on board, they primarily lived off the land. From the start, it was Captain Lewis and Captain Clark. Expedition members were never told that the War Department had given Clark the lesser rank of second lieutenant. Lewis was 29, Clark 33. Both men were about 6 feet tall, and both were seasoned soldiers with wilderness experience. In personality, Lewis tended to be introverted and somewhat moody. Clark was more outgoing and more even-tempered. Lewis was the scientific specialist, Clark the engineer and geographer. Both men were of superior intelligence. They demonstrated this in their careful planning and in their dealing with the unexpected. During the entire journey, they showed a genuine concern and respect for each other and for the other members of the expedition. For these reasons, this would prove to be one of the most successful of all North American explorations. At St. Charles, they spent 5 days reloading, buying more supplies, and waiting for Lewis, who was coming by land from St. Louis. About 50 miles upriver from St. Charles, they came to the small village of La Charette. It was the last outpost of white civilization on the river. More than 2 years would pass before they would see another white settlement. In June, heavy rains made progress slow and difficult. They were plagued by uprooted trees, moving sandbars, and collapsing riverbanks. Despite these obstacles, Lewis described the land as a happy mixture of trees and prairie, exhibiting one of the most beautiful and picturesque scenes that I ever beheld. In early August, at a place they called Council Bluff, Lewis and Clark held their first formal meeting with Indian tribes along the Missouri. They met with representatives of 2 tribes, the Otos and the Missouri. The Indians were told that their land now belonged to a great white father living in the east, and that he wanted them to live in peace with their neighbors. After they passed the peace pipe, Lewis and Clark gave the Indians gifts. One of the gifts was a peace medal, a token of friendship from President Jefferson. On August 20th, Charles Floyd died of what is now believed to have been a ruptured appendix. Clark wrote, "Sergeant Floyd died with a great deal of composure. We buried him on the top of a bluff 1/2 mile below a small river, to which we gave his name. A monument, dedicated in 1901, honors his gravesite. As they proceeded northwest, the forested limestone bluffs gave way to rolling hills and treeless plains. Also, for the first time, they were beginning to see large numbers of buffalo. Elk, prairie dogs, and pronghorn antelope. In late September, Lewis and Clark met the Teton Sioux. Fierce warriors and expert horsemen, the Teton Sioux were the terror of the Great Plains. They ravaged weaker tribes and plundered fur traders using the river. During 4 days of meetings and ceremony, the Corps of Discovery had 2 brief but tense encounters. Both occurred when the Indians tried to stop them from going upriver. Both times the Indians backed down when faced with swivel guns and rifles at close range. When news of this confrontation spread among other tribes, it virtually eliminated the chances of an attack upriver. In early November, they stopped near the villages of the Mandan. These villages had a combined population of over 4,000. 3 tribes had banded together, primarily as a defense against the Teton Sioux. Here they built a log fort and named it Fort Mandan. During short winter days and long winter nights, the explorers made plans for the following spring. The keelboat, too large to go farther upriver, would be packed with scientific artifacts and sent back to St. Louis. Was it war paint? Having never seen a black man before, curious Indians would rub their fingers across York's chest to see if the color would come off. Sometimes he would growl and tell them that before being tamed, he had been a wild beast that devoured small children. On one occasion, Clark wrote, "York made himself more terrible than we wished him to do." The maps they brought from St. Louis showed nothing beyond their present location. Seeking information and help, they hired a French-Canadian interpreter, Toussaint Charbonneau. His contribution would be minimal, but his teenage Indian wife would prove to be a real asset. Kidnapped 5 years earlier, Sacagawea belonged to the Shoshone, a tribe that lived near the Rocky Mountains, a tribe from whom Lewis and Clark were hoping to get the horses they needed to cross the Continental Divide. There was one problem. Sacagawea was expecting her first child in February. But on the other hand, to have a woman and child along was a sign of peaceful intentions. On April 7th, 1805, as the keelboat turned downstream, the 2 pirogues, along with 6 recently constructed dugout canoes, headed upstream. The Corps of Discovery now numbered 33. This included Sacagawea and her 2-month-old son, Jean-Baptiste. Lewis described their leaving. We were now about to penetrate a country at least 2,000 miles in width. The good or evil it had in store for us was for experiment to determine. On April 26th, they came to the Yellowstone, a major tributary of the Missouri. Clark noted in his journal that it would be a good place to build a fort. 24 years later, Fort Union stood at the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri. Back at Fort Mandan, the Indians had told them about a large bear that did not die easily and that pursued the hunter when wounded. At first they were not concerned, knowing their rifles were much superior to the bow and arrow. But they soon discovered that even rifles were no match for the strength and fury of an enraged grizzly. One bear had taken 8 shots and was still charging. Lewis wrote, "These bear, being so hard to die, rather intimidates us all. I must confess that I had rather fight 2 Indians than 1 bear." In late May, the bluffs along the river began to change dramatically. Lewis wrote, "The hills and river cliffs of this day exhibit a most romantic appearance. Water has trickled down the soft sand cliffs and worn it into 1,000 grotesque figures. As we pass on, it seems as if these scenes of visionary enchantment will never have an end." Pleasant scenery, however, was often interrupted by unpleasant insects. During summer months, their journals were full of complaints about the troublesome bugs and mosquitoes. Proceeding upriver, they came upon what Lewis called the grandest scene he had ever beheld, the Great Falls of the Missouri. Not just one falls, but a series of 5 falls spread over a distance of 7 miles. A grand sight, but for the Corps of Discovery, a major obstacle. They built crude wagons to carry the canoes and hoisted sails, but it still took 12 days to make an 18-mile portage around the falls. It was 18 miles of hot sun and cold rain, and 18 miles of prickly pear cactus whose sharp spines penetrated thin-soled moccasins. Above the falls, there was a canyon, and a steep-walled gorge. Lewis wrote, "From the singular appearance of this place, I called it the Gates of the Rocky Mountains." In his journal, he underlined it for emphasis. On July 25th, Clark wrote, "A fine morning. We proceeded on a few miles to the 3 forks of the Missouri." 3 days later, Lewis wrote, "We agreed to name them after the President and the Secretaries of Treasury and State. We called the Southwest Fork Jefferson's River, the Middle Fork Madison's River, and the Southeast Fork Gallatin's River." This was the place where Sacagawea had been kidnapped. It was also the place where Lewis and Clark had hoped to find the Shoshone Indians and obtain the horses they needed to cross the Rocky Mountains. But no Indians had been sighted since they left winter quarters at Fort Mandan, and no Indians were sighted now. They chose the Southwest Fork, the Jefferson, and followed it to the Beaver Head. Ascending the Beaver Head, Sacagawea recognized Beaver Head Rock, a familiar landmark from her past. But still, no sign of the Shoshone. Lewis took 3 men and headed for Lemhi Pass. Here they found the Shoshone. Never having seen white men before, the Indians were suspicious. However, 2 days later, when the remainder of the expedition arrived, suspicion turned to surprise and then elation when Sacagawea recognized her brother, Cameahwait. Cameahwait was a chief of the Shoshone, and this kinship made it much easier to barter for horses. After crossing the Continental Divide at Lemhi Pass, Lewis and Clark had hoped to find the headwaters of the Columbia. Instead, they found a small stream that flowed into the Lemhi, a distant tributary of the Columbia. The Lemhi flowed north into the Salmon, and the Salmon turned west toward the Pacific. But the Shoshone warned them that this river was impassable. Not convinced, Clark took a detachment of men and followed the river. After several miles, he concluded the Indians were right. The river was almost continuous rapids, impossible for canoes. In late August, they acquired more horses, hired an Indian guide, and proceeded up the North Fork of the Salmon River. It was treacherous going, and the steep rocky hillsides caused the horses to slip and fall. After crossing Lost Trail Pass in the Bitterroot Mountains, they followed the Bitterroot River to Lolo Creek. After 2 days' rest, they followed Lolo Creek up to Lolo Pass. West of Lolo Pass, they came to the Lochsaw, a river whose Indian name means rough water. It, too, was impassable, so they climbed up to a mountain ridge and followed it more than 100 miles. The next 8 days through the Bitterroot Mountains would be the toughest of the entire journey. There was fallen timber, deep snow, and little or no food. Clark named a small stream Hungry Creek because at that place they had nothing to eat. To avoid starvation, they killed and ate their young horses. Before it was over, dog meat and candles were added to their daily diet. Exhausted after crossing the Bitterroots, they rested for 2 weeks in the valley of the Clearwater. Here they met the Nez Perce, and these friendly Indians provided food and helped them build canoes. On the Missouri, they had toiled upstream. Now, for the first time, they would be going with the current, downstream, down the Clearwater to the Snake, down the Snake to the big river of the West, the Columbia. On the Columbia, they portaged some rapids and challenged others. They identified the snow-capped peaks of Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens. They named a large detached rock, Beacon Rock. At Beacon Rock, they began to see the rise and fall of tidewater, and tidewater meant the Pacific Ocean was not far away. November 1805. A year and a half after leaving Camp Wood, they came in sight of the Pacific Ocean. Great joy in camp, wrote Clark. We are in view of the ocean, this great Pacific Ocean which we have been so long anxious to see. Because of violent storms and a scarcity of food, they crossed over to the south side of the Columbia. On a small tributary of the Columbia, they built a log fort and named it for a friendly Indian tribe that lived nearby. At Fort Clatsop, rain and fog were so common that during their 3.5-month stay, there were only 6 clear days. By flickering candlelight, the 2 leaders updated their journals, organized scientific data, and studied maps in preparation for the return trip. Salt was needed to preserve meat. To replenish their salt supply, Lewis and Clark sent a small detachment of men to the nearby ocean. Boiling seawater in 5 kettles, they produced about 4 bushels of salt, 3 of which were saved for the return trip. On March 23rd, Clark wrote, "At this place we wintered and remained from the 7th of December, 1805, to this day, and have lived as well as we had any right to expect." They returned the same way they had come, except after crossing the Rockies, the expedition divided. Lewis explored the Marias River to the north, while Clark followed the Yellowstone to the south. In August, they reunited at the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri. Continuing downriver, the strong current of the Missouri made the return trip much faster. Arriving in St. Louis on September 23, 1806, Clark wrote, "We were met by all the village and received a hearty welcome from its inhabitants." After nearly 2.5 years and 8,000 miles, they returned in triumph. A well-deserved triumph, as their extensive findings filled in a big blank on the map of North America. First of all, they determined that an easy water passage to the Pacific did not exist. In great detail, they described over 4,000 miles of mostly unknown landscape. In great detail, they described the culture and lifestyle of more than 50 Indian tribes, some of whom had never seen a white man before. In great detail, they described hundreds of plants and animals, many of which were unknown to science at that time. In one sense, the sun has never set upon Lewis and Clark. Today, there are reminders of their epic journey all along the route. And too, their names are attached to forests, lakes, rivers, parks, colleges, and commercial establishments. And where the Snake meets the Clearwater, there are 2 cities named for the explorers, Lewiston, Idaho, and Clarkston, Washington. Even though it's dammed up and saddled with civilization, the Columbia River still retains much of the scenic beauty that awed the Corps of Discovery in 1805. As for the Missouri, much of the winding river has changed its course since the time of Lewis and Clark. North of Sioux City, Iowa, dams have spread the narrow river into wide reservoirs. On the river, keelboats were replaced by steamboats. And later on, steamboats were replaced by diesel-powered towboats. Along the river, small forts have come and gone. And large cities, farms, and rangeland have all but eliminated the wilderness of 1804. As for the Corps of Discovery, most of them scattered and vanished into obscurity. Of those who did not, one became a prosperous Missouri landowner, another a judge. 3 returned to the Rockies and were killed by Blackfoot Indians. John Coulter was the first explorer to tell about the wonders of Yellowstone, although a disbelieving public dismissed it as Coulter's Hell. Charles Floyd was the only member who did not survive the expedition. The last survivor lived until 1870. Patrick Gass lost an eye in the War of 1812, married at age 60, had 7 children, and died at age 99. York, set free by Clark, entered the freighting business in Tennessee. Sacagawea died in 1812 at Fort Manuel. a fur trading post on the Missouri River. She was about 25 years old. In 1807, Lewis was appointed governor of Upper Louisiana. But things did not go smoothly in either his public or private life. In October 1809, while traveling the Natchez Trace, he died of gunshot wounds. Was it murder or suicide? Most evidence points to suicide. Meriwether Lewis was 35. Clark stayed in St. Louis and became the first territorial governor of Missouri. Later on, he was appointed superintendent of Indian affairs for the Western Territory. He married twice, had 7 children, and named his firstborn son Meriwether Lewis Clark. After a long and distinguished career, William Clark died in St. Louis at age 68. In Bellefontaine Cemetery, a granite obelisk and bronze bust mark his burial site. The bronze bust faces the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, where on May 14th, 1804, he wrote in his journal, "I set out at 4:00 p.m. and proceeded on under a gentle breeze up the Missouri."